Glad to have you here today. We're here with you to talk about a really important subject. My name is Cindy McDonald. I am the host of the Friday Forums. This is something now it's been like 5 years that we've been doing this. I can't believe it's been that long, but it's an opportunity for me to bring experts in areas that you care about. We cover education and we cover business. And today we're going to talk more on the education side. So as you're logging in, please put in your name and your location so that my guest and friend, Eric De La Hoya, knows where you're from and has your name. So we're so excited to be able to talk about a subject that is so critical right now. We don't really have, a crystal ball, but we're going to talk about the LGBTQIA community and what we can do as counselors to make sure that our students are safe and even more importantly, have a quality of life. So, Eric, I'm so glad to have you here. We also have Carmen joining us. And as you know, she is my assistant producer, and she will take your questions and she will post links and things of that nature as we go today. So, Eric, thank you for being here today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And happy Friday, everyone.
Exactly, exactly. So as people are logging in and joining us, why don't you give us a little bit of an introduction? Tell us about yourself and like where you're located and
Sure.
what propelled you to be a college counselor.
Let's see about myself. There's a lot to say. I think as pertains to this particular topic, so I grew up in northern Colorado, a small town outside of Fort Collins. So I would say like farm adjacent or rural adjacent, if you will. And I grew up, during the 80s, during the time frame of when HIV/AIDS first hit, which was a very impactful moment, or not moment, but era in my own development. And I became involved in LGBTQIA rights very early on when I was in college at Colorado State University. And then I became the director of Northern Colorado's was an education and support nonprofit community center called the Lambda Community Center that served the queer populations of Northern Colorado, Southern Wyoming. And this was kind of in the mid 90s from there. And that was right around the time that a lot of like anti LGBTQ legislation was happening. Our charge was really to provide education and to provide safe spaces for folks who needed those from there. And I've been involved also at Basic Rights Oregon here in Portland, which is where I live now, raising funds for queer candidates running for office. I ran for office myself a couple years ago. That's a whole nother webinar. In any case, I've been doing this a long time. And I think that in between all of that, education was also just a huge, value that was set forth. I grew up in a family of two teachers, and my aunts and uncles were teachers, and so I knew I was going to go to college. But I really think back to what a wonderful place um, my schools were, elementary school through high school, and how I was so fortunate to have teachers who could kind of see, that I was a different kid who needed different supports and provided that. Even though maybe they didn't know how I was different, they knew that they provided that space for me. And so schools often provide a safe, a place of safety for our queer youth. And I think that's really important. And they can also be a difficult place for our queer youth to be as well, especially today. And so, anyway, I became an education consultant kind of by accident because I worked in college admissions at Colorado State University and then later at a small liberal arts college called Franklin in Lugano, Switzerland. And I had some wonderful friends that I worked with who were IECs, Claire Noel Glasser being one, Bob Dannenhold. I met Cindy, and then eventually I became an IEC, and well, the rest is history. And then wow, it's been 11 years ago, but I was a president of the Higher Education Consultants Association way back when. So
Wow. I my how time flies. But yes, I remember meeting you when you worked for Franklin, and we all wanted to go visit you in Switzerland.
of course.
So, from your experience, Eric, you mentioned, the group and the organization that you worked with at the university. How well are colleges doing in terms of providing meaningful supports for the queer community?
Well, I think I could probably answer this differently a year ago versus now. I think right now the question is we don't know.
Yeah.
And that's a weird place to be. But I will say, up until last year, a lot of colleges and universities have done a really great job. Like a lot of schools have specific resource offices for LGBTQ students. There are a lot of schools that have, queer studies programs, who are touting their out faculty. Whereas when I think when I was in college, there were a couple faculty members that were out, but there were many who were not, right? And there weren't
Mhm.
resource centers, but there might have been like kind of like a queer organization, through student clubs and organizations or something like that to join. But now you're seeing, in probably the last, honestly, couple decades, a real proliferation of that kind of support on campus. And you're also seeing things like many colleges and universities offering faculty same-sex, partner benefits, or marriage benefits, and now there are a good number of colleges and universities that provide gender affirming care to our trans students from there. So the lot, when you think about it, I was actually talking to someone the other day, thinking about where we are now versus when I was in high school. When I was in high school, I remember like running the shower for like 35 minutes so I could tune in and listen to a city council debate on whether or not they would support banning discrimination of queer people for public accommodation, housing, and in employment. And so now there are so many laws out there that do that. We still have gay marriage on the books. There are a lot of protections and safety nets in place that weren't there. And so I think one of the things that's hard for our students right now is that have grown up in a different time,
Mhm.
and depending on where you live, like in Portland, I work with a lot of trans students and they haven't seen I mean, they still struggle in school, but they haven't seen like the outside world where, now all of these laws are being passed and they're being targeted. So it's really shifting. And so I say we don't know right now because, as we all know, unless we don't check the news, the current administration is really, pressuring colleges and universities to gut their diversity, equity, and inclusion, initiatives. And does that mean getting rid of, office of, queer students on campus? Does that mean they can no longer have libraries, of supportive documents? Does it mean no more queer studies classes? Does it mean, and so I think the challenge out there is like, what does it actually mean? Because we're existing right now in this whole just a bunch of noise, right? And
Mhm.
so I think what's really important. So I also am an outgoing board member, government relations committee for PNACAC, which is the Pacific Northwest regional affiliate of NACAC. And we went to Washington, D.C. To do some education lobbying about a month ago. And it's really important to remember that things like executive orders are not laws, and that most laws are still in place. But what institutions do when there's pressure from the executive branch is one thing. And what I'm actually, at first, I'm I was very disheartened to see certain schools that rhyme with like Columbia and Michigan, basically caving preemptively to this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
But what I'm really heartened at is seeing how much like Harvard is stepping up right now. And you see Big Ten schools suddenly being like the education NATO, um, you know, and really thinking about, no, we need to make sure that our students are safe on campus, that we are a place of ideas and we are a place of diversity and we are a place of inclusion. And so we're kind of in the middle of this tug, push and pull right now, which makes it really hard for our queer students to know, is this a good place for me? Is it not? And makes it even more difficult for us to know that and know how things shift, and how quickly they do or do not. So again, we're like in an unknown space. Those places for safety exist now. Will they exist a year from now for our students? It's kind of like even thinking about funding, for
Mhm.
schools. We can think a campus is healthy, and 3 years later, they're talking about shutting their doors. So there's no great answer. Sadly. Even though I just talked for like a million minutes. Yeah.
Well, but you're giving us some information and some thoughts for consideration in terms of what to really look for. And not only is it concern for students, but what about their parents? How
Yeah.
are they looking at this? And oftentimes, the parents are very protective of their students. We see this in the neurodivergent community as well as if you have a neurodivergent student. What kind of things can we share with
Yeah.
parents, or what are you seeing with parents?
Well, we all know we deal with stressed out parents all the time. I mean, I'm sure I don't. And yeah, but yeah. Lots of anxious parents just in general about this process. All right. So add on top of that your son or daughter's gender identity, or, they've just come out and you're really not just worried about are they going to get the best education, but are they going to be safe?
Mhm.
And I think that's the biggest thing I think that's been most difficult for me to grapple with is that I remember I used to talk to families about, well, yeah, there are these, safer places even in red states. You can go to Texas and you can go to Austin or San Antonio or even Dallas, like the urban areas and these great schools like TCU and Trinity and can be a really great place, for your student because they're going to be supported, on those campuses. And I used to, obviously students always make their own decisions, but we would have the discussion like, well, do you want to go to a place where maybe you can affect change, for yourself and other people, and is that something that you want to be part of your process? And some students really relished that opportunity, right? Well, now with parents and with students, we have to have the discussion, well, okay, that was all good and fine a few years ago. But now, if you're in certain states, your son or daughter is not going to legally have gender affirming care, which is actually physically, I mean, that's detrimental to physical health, not just, mental health, but physical health. Because once you've started hormone treatments, as a trans person or you're transitioning or whatever, part of that journey you're along, you can't just shut that off. It's just like if your student is on antidepressants or things like that. Not to say those
Right.
two are the same thing, but as an example, you can't just take someone off of medication. That
Mhm.
messes with your body. And so you're thinking about that actual real physical safety, but then you're also thinking about, okay, if you're in a state where the laws no longer actually protect you and they exclude you, is that a place that you should go? And so you think about the application process or the college accessibility is actually more exclusive for queer and trans students in this situation, right? It's not just exclusive. Am I going to get into an Ivy League school? It's like, oh, where can I actually go in the country? And so, I sent Cindy some resources last night, and a really good resource out there. The two of them are the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Human Rights. Coalition. HRC, I should know this. I've only known them for 30 years. But HRC and ACLU both have maps where you can just click on the states and learn what anti-LGBTQ legislation is across the board. What I really like is that HRC has one where you can actually look down and see what type of legislation you're looking at. So if you want to look for, trans legislation, or if you want to look at all those different things. So it can give you a little bit of a sense, or honestly, you can empower your families and your students to look at that, to really research what's important to them. I think what's really hard in working with queer students, and this has always been the case, is that, well, first of all, you can't really work with them as queer students unless they come out to you and they disclose, right? You can never make an assumption, and you can't just say, yeah, I know you're gay. And so you can't do that, but the other thing is that we don't actually know like where they are on their journey. We don't know where they are leaning politically either, including their families. And so it's really a challenging piece, but to be able to give those resources to our families to be able to investigate those is really important. And to help them understand that it's no longer just political things, but there are legal things that students have to work, think about when it comes to their safety and their success. And I can just attest to this in my own life, it'd be so, so nice if I could get back all the hundreds and thousands of hours that I've had to spend, kind of fighting or, trying to, make sure that I, and honestly just, people like me have the equal opportunity and accessibility. Like think about that, what that does to our young people and their families when they're spending all this time here, when it could be like, oh, you know what? I could be creating another project, or I could be, doing something else with this without having to do that. But that's where they're at. And we have to remind them that this is a really challenging time. Um, and they've got to look at these things.
Well, it reminds me of the conversation we had years ago and with you and Scott Garbini. And you guys told us that there are places in the world that you are not safe to go.
Mhm.
And to think about that there are now places in the US where that is also true
Yeah.
for students and we oftentimes we just don't realize that or think about that.
Mhm.
Um, so for our and is it difficult? I mean, when we're working with their students, they're minors, they're not 18. Most of the time when they go to college, they've turned 18. I mean, I was 17. I went to college early. So I was 17 in college, but most of our students turn 18 while they're in college. How does that change the dynamics? Or if they're 17 when they go to college, does that make any difference? Do you know?
Well, I mean, the big piece is, of course, once a student turns 18, then they are considered an adult and do not need, parents do not have access to information, and I'm so totally forgetting what the law is. It's not HIPAA, it's
FERPA.
thank you.
FERPA.
Thank you,
Yeah,
FERPA.
it's the
Okay.
FERPA
Yeah.
law.
I'm not in common application mode at the moment yet. But with FERPA, you do really um, you know, students do have, the abilities to, research these opportunities and to be involved without disclosure. And I think that, part of it too is that, we make assumptions, I think, sometimes based on where we live. And if a student is in Portland, I'm assuming they're in a safe household, but they may not be,
Hmm.
and so we can't assume that either. And so it's like, being able to share resources with students, or at least help them know that they're out there, is really important. And a lot of students, honestly, still do wait to come out until they're in college. They're
Hmm.
out of the home. They know they have a place to live for a while. I was just doing a little bit of, quick Google stuff last night, and this was a really astonishing fact that I knew our houseless or homeless population is disproportionately, especially among youth, disproportionately queer. But what I didn't realize is that 40% of queer youth at one point or another have been homeless.
Wow.
That could be, maybe, they, were in a hotel for a few nights before they figured something out. But that's still, think about when we were 16 or 17 when that whole safety net is picked up. And so it's like, I think about this from our perspective of how do we help students, understand what's out there and how to make good decisions for themselves and how to be safe. But the other thing is, earlier I talked about executive orders and them not being law, but those also are very harmful to our youth,
Mhm.
right? If all you hear on social or see on social media, things like that, are executive orders saying there are only two sexes, or, the whole brouhaha over trans athletes right now. Here's a little factoid for you, for your dinner table conversations. There are currently 10, actually less than 10, collegiate athletes who are trans athletes. In high school, there are 5 that legitimate organizations have counted. And so when you think about like in high school, there are over like, I think in college alone, this might be wrong. I think there's like 500,000 college athletes. In high school, that amount is even bigger. So you think about what a little bit that is. But I really think about as consultants, we have this job to identify opportunities, but we also have this job to model acceptance and, model support of our young people. And mental health is already a struggle for a lot of our students, even those
Mhm.
who are non-queer, right? I mean, that's just a rising epidemic that we've seen in the last several years. Among queer students, that's higher, and that's going to be even higher, based on what they're hearing all the time. I should find this study. I'll try to find this study. I read it probably a month ago, and it was about for let's see, for states or areas that have laws that protect, queer youth, um, queer populations, basically the mental health of, young queer people improves. When laws are passed to, target them or exclude them, it goes downhill. And
Mhm.
we know that suicidal ideation and suicide attempts are higher among queer and trans youth, higher among trans youth than queer youth. Sometimes as much as like, 3 times as high is
Mhm.
our population. And then when those trans and queer youth of color, you add that in, that's even higher, especially among Black and Native populations. Native populations are the number one, which is
Wow.
interesting because Native populations traditionally um, have been quite supportive of queer and trans people. In fact, that's where the term, if you ever hear the term two spirit, that's where that comes from, is from
Mhm.
certain native cultures. Like I remember in college reading about the Berdache tradition among the Lakota people. And the Berdache was basically a trans or non-binary person within that particular tribe who was highly revered and was considered to be very gifted because they were so different and often sometimes played the role of, the medicine person, or things like that, or was charged with the care of children, and so it's interesting to see that among native populations, it's so much higher recently. Yeah.
Yeah, that is an interesting statistic. I know when right after the elections, the crisis hotline, the queer crisis hotline, especially the suicide hotline, went up like 600, 700%
Yeah.
just right after the election.
Well, and a little side note to that, they get about 2,100 calls per day.
Wow. Wow.
And when the new budget comes out, that is on the federal chopping block.
Yeah.
So we think about the resources and making sure that we have resources for our young people, thinking
Mhm.
about, what's available in, your community is really important. Some of these things. So it used to the queer crisis. I can't don't remember the actual name of it, but the national crisis hotline that um, that's out there. It's run by the or it's basically staffed by the Trevor Project.
Hmm.
That's out there now. You just call 988 and you get through. So it's like 911, but it's
Hmm.
988. So all the funding is in jeopardy for that, and that is something that can be cut right now. That's not an executive order, and that potentially could go through Congress. It probably would pass the House. I don't know that it would pass the Senate.
Hmm.
But those are things. But even when you hear that in passing, that a lot of people don't care about having a crisis line for you.
Yeah.
Imagine what that does. So it's like it's such a strange time to be in, honestly, because I think of, we try to push our students, right? Because we try to, make sure they get their things done. And I've really had to take a step back, especially with my trans students, just to make sure they're okay.
Hmm.
And and I might be overstepping the line. I don't think I am in Portland, but I'm having real conversations with my trans students about, you know, how are you? Because I feel like it's not my job to be like, okay, yeah, if my student hasn't done their homework, usually I get a little frustrated. We do, right? And we're like,
Hmm.
well, now, you've had 3 weeks to do this, but I'm thinking, okay, my trans student right now is just worried about existing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a real different kind of counseling model that we have all been thrust into, you know, which is sad.
It is, but it highlights, and I see we have a question. I'll let you give it to
Mm.
us here in just a second, Carmen, because it's a very relevant question. But it highlights our role as counselors and whatever side of the desk, because I know today we have people from colleges, we have counselors, we even have parents. Whatever side of the desk we sit on, that's that counseling side. And if our students aren't feeling safe and secure, then they can't move forward. It's just, they have to, that's that fundamental Pavlov, fundamental aspects of it. I can share an experience when I was a counselor. We had one of our students, and the teacher came in. It's like the student's not doing anything. She's sitting under the table and she's just not listening. I went in, she was basically in a fetal position. But then when I talked to her, I discovered, yeah, I'm amazed that she could even get up and go to school every day because of the things that were going on in her family and her life and everything. I mean, the fact that she even just walked on campus was a miracle. But, we look at the outside, we got to dig into what's really going on. So, Carmen, go ahead and share the
Yeah.
question. It's a very
Um,
relevant one.
Eric, can you talk about the intersectionality between the LGBTQIA plus students and neurodiversity, and what might we think about to support individuals in that intersection?
Hmm. I am not an expert in this particular area, to be honest. So what I'm going to say is probably anecdotal. Okay. And my understanding in terms of things that I have read is that there is a larger percentage of those who are neurodivergent that do identify as queer or trans, you
Mhm.
know. And so, well, right now we're seeing cuts in those areas too. And we're seeing basically it's kind of like a double edge here. I think they're getting hit from both sides because we're seeing really just the devaluation of students who are different. If we really boil it down to that, I think there's this kind of strange, first of all, I'm going to tell you right now, I think we're in a temporary space. I'm actually quite hopeful seeing what I'm seeing with people like really kind of coming together. It was very, like I said, again, the NATO of colleges really is very cool. Things like that. People, coming together to support each other and communities are really important at this particular time. And I think counselors like us provide that community for our students. and for our families. And they are our community as well. So, there's kind of that piece that also, backs us up. I mean, I think like when I'm having that day, because we've all had those days recently, right? And when I have those days, but then I meet with the young people that I meet with, I'm like, okay, you know what? We're in this space now, but we don't have to be in this space forever. And I don't think we will.
Right.
And I think that's so important to recognize. But I think when you have students who have very clear, demonstrated learning differences or neurodivergence, in there and in schools are required, to provide those resources. They're not required to provide resources for queer students in most cases, unless it's a certain state, right?
Mhm.
That's just an extra, it's basically an extra block tied on you when you're sinking, and it's like, not to be, graphic about that, but it really is, so, oh, these things that make me unique and that I'm being told at home, hopefully they're being told at home, that that's what makes them unique and worthy of love and acceptance is suddenly just being torn away from them in both directions. I can't imagine how that would feel, as a young person, to really feel invalidated at that level. And so I'm concerned. I guess I don't know if I'm really answering that question very well, to be honest. I don't know if there's like a more specific way you want me to answer that. But again, I'm not an expert other than knowing, that there's more
Mhm.
prevalence. Yeah.
Mhm. That there is a lot of intersection in that. But it points to some of the questions that we can ask as we're counselors, as we're visiting
Yeah.
campuses, and the information we can provide to families to say, here are some questions. Here are the places to go visit. So I have a two-part question for you. One other thing I think really is standing out in this conversation is the understanding of rights. What is the difference between an executive order and a law or declaration? So should we be, I know some, in Congress, they're doing trainings. I've heard about that up in Oregon and Washington. Just like, so people know what their rights are. Is that something that we should be looking at with, helping our students to know where they stand and
Yeah.
that empowers them?
Well, I would really, and I'm not a member of IECA, so I'm not really sure what they're doing, but I would really issue a challenge to both, HECA and IECA, as well as NACAC. And NACAC is working on that, but our regional affiliates as well, to honestly be able to provide clear information to us, as
Mhm.
consultants, because we're the conduit to which, or through which our students gain that information, right? And it's really hard to know what is true and not true these days, right? You see something, okay, I didn't fall for this, but there was a whole bunch of stuff online that April 20th we were going to be under martial law.
Oh, yeah, I
Yeah,
heard about that.
and because there's a lot of fear, out there, right? And we have to make sure we don't allow our fear to keep us from actually doing research and kind of trying to weed through that. And I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not going to devalue the fact that it's really hard to sift through a lot of the misinformation right now, but we really have to. But I think the onus is one of the things that I'm hoping we can do at PNACAC in the next few years is to provide basically a site for our members to know exactly what the laws are and what they are not. Like I said, like right now, a lot of these executive orders are kind of like preemptive strikes. But what we found recently yesterday is that the courts are saying, no, you can't do this. You can't
Mhm.
do this. You can't do this. So while we're in this horrible like situation, it's kind of more of a quagmire than it is like a series of dominoes being, knocked down. And so right now, there are things that are standing up, for that. And so, but I think as consultants, this goes back to what you just said, Cindy, about, asking questions of colleges and universities. But I think, we represent our young people and and honestly, we probably work with a lot more students who are technically on some kind of fringe, whether they're neurodivergent or they're queer or, and we need to make sure that we're supporting our colleges while also pushing our colleges to do the right thing. You know, we're not really their constituents, but it's no different than telling your elected official, what you expect out of them.
Mhm.
I mean, we need to tell our colleges, and I think there are lots and lots of colleges that are definitely starting to realize, okay, we can stand up here. All these things that are threats have not really happened yet. Just this has nothing to do with this, but like just recently, all of the, research on women's healthcare was quite threatened.
Mhm.
Well, now they've gone back on that because they've seen the backlash. And so I think that we have to do the same kind of thing with our colleges. I mean, I think NACAC this year is going to be very interesting. That's all I'm going to say. And I don't mean that as like I want to brawl, but I think there's accountability that has to happen, from colleges and universities. And I think that that's how we support our students too. It's not direct with them, but it's actually very important. Yeah.
So I agree with that, totally. And it is a time, and it is, it's a time to see how colleges, higher education is reacting, as well as other institutions in our country. Are there specific questions or specific things that we can be looking for, or we should, like when we send our students out to go visit with their parents, like are there certain things that are very indicative of the support or an inclusive environment on a campus that has nothing to do with any of these other. I
Yeah.
mean, sometimes it's either they have it or they don't, and
Yeah.
I have had conversations. I'm going to have Stefano Papaleo and Greg Zeiser. Greg's from Elon University and Stefano is from Lynn University. And in my conversations with them, they're like, we've always been inclusive. We've always tried to embrace students from all sorts of different backgrounds, and we're not going to do anything different. So there are those and
Yeah.
that's just two examples. I know there are many, many others, but so what are some questions or things that we should be looking for that might indicate that?
Well, I always think that, and this goes back to even trying to find queer friendly, colleges or
Mhm.
queer friendly is not the right word. I mean, I think that colleges that provide great support, let's just say that.
Mhm.
I think first of all, the prevalence of a non-discrimination statement in their mission statement, a clause that says we do not discriminate based on race, sexual orientation, and it should also include gender identity.
Okay.
Okay. That's really important. If it does not include gender identity, it might be an okay place for your queer students. Definitely not going to be a great place, for your trans or non-binary students. I think that that's really important. I would argue that if they don't see the full spectrum of queer identity, within, gender, identity or that it's probably not a great place for your queer students. That mission statement is honestly the biggest statement of value that that college or university has. And then after that, then you got to say, well, are they actually living up to their mission statement? And to me, that means, is there a presence of an LGBTQ, office, like you might have, a Black Student Services or, Asian Pacific American Student Services, like, pieces like,
Veterans. I mean,
yeah, or if like some colleges have, kind of a diversity, fully inclusive, like diversity office, when you look at that website, does it include sexual orientation and gender identity within that? you know so that's important. I think looking for then taking a look at the student clubs and organizations. Is there like a queer organization, a queer group organization? There might even be trans organization, on there. What does that look like? I think the other part is matching that with state laws and things like that too, because I think, again, it's great if the institution, there's so many wonderful institutions in these places that have states. And I hate to say this because I love these institutions. But again, if a student is walking through Texas and doesn't have the same support, or something happens to that student, they're not protected as maybe a cis heterosexual student would be protected in a lot of cases, even if you're protected on that campus. And we know our students are not just staying on that campus the entire time. So, and that's a big shift for me, and how I have to think about these things. Because I was always like, go to the source, you learn a lot more sometimes when you have to really deal with adversity, and so, but then I think that in addition to that, then some of the things I mentioned earlier, like, is there a queer studies major? You know, are there out faculty members? Those really make a difference, I think, for a student's. Is there gender affirming housing? You know, I remember going to, I won't say the name of this college, but it was on a tour of a Northeast state several years ago. And I remember being in the audience, and I asked a question about, what about, trans students on campus? And they're like, oh, well, we have, gender affirming bathrooms. Well, the trans question should be answered in a lot different ways than just we have a bathroom, because it's like, are your trans students going to be safe in housing? Is there gender affirming care? Another thing that's really important if you're working with a trans student. And so though you kind of have to almost like ask further in those questions. Sometimes we know on a student panel, students don't know all those answers, and we have to be patient with them and understand that. But with a staff member from a college or university, they should know that.
Mm-hmm.
They should have that information. And if they struggle, like again with this, I will not send a queer or trans student, well, frankly, a young woman, to this particular school based on what I experienced on that campus. And so it's really important to be aware of those things.
Yeah, very true. And that gives us some really good finite things. And everything you've described now with AI makes that kind of research so much easier.
Yes.
And now you can do the deep research. So, and we can do it, our students can do it, the parents can do it. There's ways to do it much easier and faster now than there used to be. Carmen, go ahead.
Yeah. Is Campus Pride still a good resource? Last time I looked at it, it looked like it hadn't been updated recently.
I think they've done a great job, but they don't update as often. And the other thing that I notice in anything that has like rankings of great, like queer friendly colleges and universities, like The Advocate had a book that came out several years ago. The Advocate is a gay magazine or publication. They tend to skew towards the big schools and the names still, just like a US News and World Report. So it doesn't tell the whole story. I think it's a good place to start. I will say that it's a good place also for good financial resources, for our queer kids. There are a good number of queer and trans focused scholarships out there, which can really help our students in getting back to the family question, our families in college affordability. But I haven't seen it updated recently either. So, I think you just have to kind of keep, checking, but I don't think it's a bad, uh, I think it's probably a nonprofit organization that, like most nonprofits, sometimes, they're really up and running, and other times, they're trying to hold it together. And maybe that's what's going on now. It's just hard to say. And I don't really have a lot of inside information about that, but don't discount the information on there. It still has good resources. In fact, I think Scott and I used that as a really nice resource during our session a couple years ago.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, now with things that are changing on a daily basis, the minute you publish something, especially like that, it's going to be out of date.
Yes.
So, look for the good information, and then, use searches and things to find different aspects. Eric, what about in other countries? Are we looking at now, is it safer to sit, we're looking not only about safety, but quality of life. And you've touched on a lot of different aspects of that. Are they going to find a better quality of life someplace else?
That's such an interesting question because, obviously it really depends on that student. I think about students who have been out and have been supported for a long time and how they're more mature in their development at that point, I think you're good to go overseas. And I'll talk about that more generally in a bit. I think if a student is pretty new to that process, it's pretty tough because they're going to go into a space, especially if they have support at home, where they're thousands of miles away, and that's tough. Um, I will say, so the last few years, I work with a fair number of students who apply internationally. Now, if they end up going is another story. But I had like a dozen students apply to colleges in the UK and Ireland last year. And um, and so I've been focusing a lot of my travels in that area. Well, also because I just want to go there, but
I know
uh,
that's kind of the
and
nice added benefit, right?
yes, but what I love is that it's just so prevalent at most of these universities in terms of their support, but also Europe's ahead of us, in so many ways, and a lot of social issues, or so I don't like the word issue, but that's really but I think that, you know, I can tell you any of the schools I visited in Scotland and any of them I visited in Ireland and those that I visited, in England. Um, it's funny, there doesn't even need to be an extra, like, I didn't even have to ask the questions,
Hmm.
of the school, whether or not they would be a good place, because I saw little, like I saw rainbow flags, on office windows. In the literature, it even talked about that, you can identify your appropriate gender, on the UCAS, like all of those different pieces that to me, I don't even need to have to ask the question because they are so there, with that with the information. So I think it's a really good opportunity. I do think, like, I if I had children, I would be sending them to like the UK or Scotland, to college for these next few years if I could. Number one, it's a lot more affordable.
Yep,
But number
it certainly
two,
is.
like I feel like they would be safer just in general, and plus they, gain that larger worldview. But I also understand that it's really hard for a young person to go that far away from home.
Mhm.
And it takes a really, having worked at a college in Switzerland, I know what a leap that is to have to do that. And so, that's probably really Pollyanna of me, but I think it's a really good opportunity. But there are other places that you will need to ask those questions. I think in some cases, Australia can be good, New Zealand can be good,
Mhm.
but also some of those places within those areas may not be good,
Mhm.
you know um but you do have to also pay attention to, some of the countries, and we are seeing, what we're experiencing here is not just a US thing. It's kind of a global thing that we're dealing with right now. And so part of it is like, you know this social kind of upheaval that we have that's impacting, us. No place, in the world is going to be immune to that. But I think it's how populations and how strong, populations are and communities are that will help make that a better place. And honestly, right now, like, I mean, I really think, like, the UK and Ireland and are a very, very good place for our students. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. And that's something, again, as counselors, that we parents and students may be aware of it a little bit more than parents, but they might be a lot more receptive to it right now than they might have been, a few years ago. It's like there's lots of places in the US. Well, but your point about being prepared and the maturity level and such is true for students regardless. So,
Correct.
Carmen, go ahead. I see a question. I don't have an answer to it. I don't know if Eric will or not,
Yeah.
but let's find out.
Uh-oh.
You're going to put you on the spot.
Who is privileged to students' information if they write about being gay? Just as an example, in their college essay, or they share that they prefer LGBTQ housing. Like in this day and age, while it's important to share, I worry about who can gain access to that.
Well, that wasn't the question I was thinking, but that's a
Oh,
really
okay.
good question.
That's a great question, and I got to tell you, like, it's unknown. And I think that's the real challenge. Could we think about the same thing with our undocumented students?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, for 4 years, we've been in this place where they've been able to disclose parent information, things like that on financial aid forms and or forms with the different colleges and universities that are highly supportive. And now, um, you know, my best guess right now is that with state institutions, I'm not sure because laws can be passed pretty quickly, you know,
Mm-hmm.
by the states, because those are governed by state legislatures, you know, or they have to, you know, do those things, just like, you know, testing, right? Um, you know, some of the state legislatures had to approve test optional, like that kind of stuff. For private colleges and universities, my sense is that it's probably a little bit safer just because, you know, they're they are private, you know, so they aren't at the whim of state legislative, you know, politics. They're not at the whim, you know, of they can hold on to that information or they can at least hold it up in court, you know, for a while, you know. And my hope is that most of these colleges and universities, again, the NATO kind of plan, you know, support each other in all of this and push back against this kind of stuff. But I do feel like that information, you know, is tough. Like, I mean, one thing that was able to happen is now the US government can technically spy on, you know, queer people and their activities online, you know. So I don't know what that means, you know, and I don't know what that means, you know, based on, you know, what a young person, you know, puts out there. And so that's really troubling, you know, in terms of that. So there was a law that was passed a while ago that kind of protected that, and now it's been rescinded. So I think
So
that,
they can just look up their social media and
yeah,
then use
yeah,
that against
yeah.
them.
Or there's the law that prevents the surveillance no longer exists. I'd have to really look up where that is, but that's something that
Mhm.
did happen.
Mhm.
Um, you know, so I think that, you know, some of those safety mechanisms are have been damaged or some are gone. Um,
Mhm.
I still feel that queer people are safer, you know, in this country than they were 30 years ago, um,
Mhm.
50 years ago, and so on. Um, what'll be really interesting is there's a challenge, and I'm not sure when it's if there have been arguments yet or not. And I think it's out of Colorado. I'm not sure. But it's basically a challenge that so a lot of states have passed laws for, you know, against conversion therapy
Mhm.
for
For
students.
minors.
Yeah, for minors and and so there is a case that's making its way to the Supreme Court about that.
Mhm.
You know, so like there are some things that, you know, again are just we're again, I think it's really important to put this in perspective. So I don't want to paint this like totally gray picture because I think there's so much beauty and great stuff happening that we just don't get out there because
Mhm.
the media wants us to panic buy their stuff. They want us to panic click on things. They make more money that way. How they so that's why it is so important for us to kind of be just like in this crazy college process. No one's getting in. Da 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 da. Da. I'm not perfect enough. I'm not good enough. But the thing is that for we provide that place of solace for our students and that place of reason for our students to kind of get out of that noise. And so the skill set is already there for us. It's just the knowledge base around queer and trans folks is upon us to learn a little bit more. And so we can support them that way. So it's the structure is the same, it's just the information's different.
I think that is very, very wise advice. And that's something we can take and remind ourselves too, because we succumb to all of this very negative news and things happening right now. And it's not all doom and gloom, and empowering um, looking to the future and our students and what we can do to help them, and that's the key thing to be able to do. So, any last words? And I'm going to just address the question in the chat was, can students access the national health systems in the UK? That it looks like Karen says yes, but
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if they probably buy in a little bit with their student fees, would be my guess, but yes, yeah, that's available. And even again, like gender affirming care, things like that
Mhm.
available
Yeah,
and
that makes a
cheap.
big difference. It makes a
Yeah.
huge amount of difference. So
Cindy, I
any,
wanted to add just a little to what you said, because I think this is really important for all of us to remember, whether it's in here or just every day. It's like, no one can take your joy from you.
right.
No one can take who you are from you unless you let them. And I'm not discounting like how challenging the times are that we live in, but the best way to push back against that is just to, live your life as yourself and to experience those moments of joy. And I think that's kind of what I try to do with my kids, like when we're in those meetings, it's like I think we've all been there when we're like, didn't get it done again, or like I'm tired, it's application season. And I think it's good to just take a few minutes to laugh, or to really, especially, and I'm really cognizant of this with my trans students, just to kind of like appreciate where they're at, and let them know that you're in their corner
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that you believe everything that they say, that their voice really does matter. And then to also let them know that in this crazy time, there are lots and lots of people who feel exactly the same way.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that goes a long way, especially when you think about, all the pressure they're feeling under. So go ahead.
No, I thank you. I think those are very excellent words to close with, and just nobody can take your joy away. And that applies all the way around. And there's nothing more resilient or more uplifting or more everlasting than having that perspective. So thanks for sharing that, Eric.
Mhm.
I think that's really very good. So
Yeah.
our hours always just fly by. Thank you so much. I appreciate seeing you. Can you tell us a little bit about your project, though, your film? I mean, I don't want to
Oh
let
yeah,
you
yeah,
go
yeah.
without you telling
Sure,
people a
sure.
little bit
Okay, I'm
about
looking
what.
at, okay, got it. How do I do this quickly? In my other life, I am producing, I already produced a short film called Cowboy Boots, which is making its way around the film festival circuit. I've got a second one coming out shortly called State Rep, which is about state politics. It's kind of a comedy. And then 2 weeks from today, I'm hopping in a vehicle with two people from Portland, and we're driving to Pine Bluffs, Wyoming, where we are filming my first feature-length film. And it's basically about a 35-year-old man who is returning home to rural Nebraska after being gone for 16 years, a queer man who went to San Francisco, never came back. And now he's coming back and um, basically repairing relationships, but finally coming back as his own self, and setting his boundaries. And it's been a beautiful experience. The whole town of Pine Bluffs is in on this. We're having a great time, and yeah, so stay tuned to that. If anyone wants to follow me on Instagram with that, it's Harriet Productions, and you can find that on Instagram. And that follow what we're doing. Or you can just follow me on Instagram because I put it on there too. And you can follow me at Eric Delahoy.
That's so fantastic. We're so
Yeah.
excited. It's so exciting to see all of that coming to fruition. So thank you very much. We will have next week. We're going to have another Friday forum. I'm going to be meeting with an IEC, and we're going to talk about expanding your business. So Deborah Landsberg is going to join me next Friday, the end of May. So I'm going to be taking a break. I'm going to go to IECA in Detroit. I'm going to WACAC in Las Vegas. So any of those regional organizations that you participate in, now is the time to go and ask these questions and just show that support. And then we'll be back the end of May. And I have Amy Smith, and we're going to talk about marketing. So everybody have a great weekend. Eric, thank you again so much. Carmen, thank you as always. And I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys again next week. Thank you.